Maia Kobabe describes their gender and sexual identity journey. I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a graphic novel that I read. I am still on that graphic novel grind, and today's graphic novel is all about gender and sexual identity and questioning those sorts of things throughout your life. I am referring to Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe, which was published in 2020. For those who don't know, Maia Kobabe is an American writer who got work published in the past 10 or so years. I should note that Maia uses EMR sort of pronouns. I might also supplant it with they, them, because that's just what my mind defaults to, which I don't feel is that offensive. If it is, correct me. And if I end up slipping into she, her, hers at all, please definitely write something in the comments. It's not intentional. I talk a mile a minute, and sometimes I make a few errors here and there. So that's first and foremost. Maia Kobabe is queer identity sort of person. They have been. They've been getting the work published for the past 10 years, as I said, writing graphic novels and the like, and they've also, they're primarily known for writing this, Genderqueer, which is a high-quality graphic novel that earned them a number of accolades and awards, but it also drew the ire of conservative groups and concerned parents who were determined to get this book banned from local libraries, school libraries, and similar, because they said that it wasn't aimed at children. Now, why is this kind of getting banned, and how did it end up as the number 2 banned book in the United States? I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section. But Maia Kobabe became quite notable after that because of their association with this book. And it did lead to a further book deal afterwards. So, drawing attention to things doesn't always necessarily work in the way that you think it will, because it just resulted in a bigger book deal for this particular author, which I think is fascinating. Beyond that, the other sort of stuff that I wanted to talk about as it pertains to Maia can probably be found in here. So let's talk about it. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Genderqueer focuses, of course, on Maia Kobabe. Maia recalls their life growing up in a rural area with chill, laid-back parents, kind of hippie-like. They growing up on a farm, not really pressured to do one thing or another. But when they get into elementary school, they have to go to a local school, and there are a whole bunch of new norms that Maia has to abide by. In particular, norms applied typically to assigned female at birth individuals, which Maia does not feel that they are understanding or anything like that. E is understanding. They try to catch up, but it's not really working out for them. And this is made all the worse by the fact that they have to go through puberty. They do not like the feeling of puberty. It feels wildly uncomfortable. And growing hair on their legs in particular doesn't feel great as well. However, things are made a little bit better once the school creates a queer alliance club. Many of the people in there are allies, some are actually gay, but Maia specifically notes that E doesn't really feel comfortable with kind of disclosing their identity. They don't know where they exactly fall because they're kind of questioning their sexual identity and gender identity. Not really clear on where exactly they fall because they do have attraction to men and women and fantasies about men and women, and it's unclear about what exactly that means for M there. And as they get into college, they become they start to dress more masculine or masculine presenting. And college allows them to sort of further flesh that out and also explore relationships, which again they don't really feel all of that comfortable with. And things again are made more uncomfortable when they have to go to a gynecologist, and the feeling of all that it leads to them crying in their car for like 30 minutes afterwards. So it's not a good feeling, and it sort of helps them realize that vaginal penetration isn't really their jam. So they're sort of understanding more things about themselves through these uncomfortable means. Maia details a new relationship that E finds themselves in, and they come to understand that they're into sort of autoandrophilia, which is the idea of a assigned female at birth type person wearing a strap-on, essentially, or having the idea of penetrating others, which is probably more detailed than I need to go into, but they like that, they like the fantasy of it, but when it comes to actually doing it during sex, it doesn't fulfill their fantasies in the way that they would hope. And after having sex a couple times, they're like, I'm not really sure that this is what I'm into all that much, and they go through a breakup with this person, which is a sad moment because it seemed like they found a lot of support and love in there, but that's ultimately their decision. After this broke up, they start experimenting with new pronouns, specifically Spivak, which is what I'm referring to with EMR, if I'm even pronouncing those correctly, and those feel sort of right for Maia, as they recall the sort of uncomfortable gender dysphoria that comes with being called she, her type pronouns. And a short while later, they have to go through a gynecologist appointment, a pap smear, and they've kind of been putting this off for a while. And their initial appointment does not go well. They describe the uncomfortability and the fear and the anguish that they're dealing with. The doctor manages to put it off, but they have to go back a second time later, where they're under the influence of, or not under the influence, but they're using anxiety medications, which seem to help, although not really that much. And then as the story really comes to a close, Maia discusses their work in a comics workshop where they're teaching young children about comics, and this leads up to a bunch of worries and some concerns about whether they should disclose who they are, whether that would make parents angry, which it might in fact do, as we saw by the backlash to this graphic novel, and sort of considering the kids and whether they might be going through something similar to what Maia went through, and the end result is kind of holding back as they still pursue more discovery of who they are as a person. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about with gender queer. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it has a similar vibe to some stories that I've been reading pretty recently. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, Flamer by an author whose name I can't remember, and I would also say I, Miha, sort of about struggling to better understand yourself in regards to a certain identity. Maybe not being comfortable in your own skin as well. And, all of those stories are somewhat challenged in library and in school circles by conservative people who don't want children exposed to the radical ideas that are presented in there. So let's look at what radical ideas are presented here. Which is sarcasm on my part, because I don't think they're really that radical. Nothing that certainly hasn't been said before, and isn't easily accessible by children who have access to the internet, and requires a lot of involvement of parents to control what messages are being sent to your children. Parental involvement is very key, and that just doesn't happen these days. But that's another point entirely. One of the main things that Kobabe is talking about here is fitting in. Maia struggles to adhere to gender norms and gender expectations of how E should act and whatnot. This pertains to shaving, Like Maia doesn't like the feeling of shaving their legs, wearing certain clothing. They find that male clothing is more comfortable for them, getting haircuts, going through relationships and not being comfortable with relationships. And it's important to note that there's no pressure from heir parent, E's parents, or something like that. They're kind of laid back people, and they never really force one thing or another on Maia. But maybe that might have sort of guided them in a better way, helped them figure things out, and especially going to school, because they feel like they're kind of struggling to play catch up with others. And that's not necessarily saying that their parents are doing a bad thing. It's just that, somebody needs to, inform young people about the social norms so that they can then later break them to their heart's content, but so they can at least initially abide by it and not feel like they're playing a guessing game there. That's a very complicated sort of train of thought if you think about it. And ultimately, the question that Maia has is where do E fit in? Where do they fit in? And the answer is that maybe they might not fit anywhere. Maybe there's just too many factors at play for them. There's too many factors at play for everybody. Like, not everyone necessarily fits in. But where is the niche for E? Like, where does Maia fit in on, or even like what identity can they grasp for, or something like that? That's really a struggle. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. "My deepest emotional relationships have always been with women. Did that mean I was a lesbian? But my sexual fantasies involved 2 male partners. Was I a gay boy trapped in a girl's body? The knowledge of a third option slept like a seed under the soil," which is a good quote, kind of highlighting this sort of like questioning aspect of it. Like, if I like this thing, what am I? And if I like that thing, how do these things combine? It's sort of understanding that the gender binary is unhelpful and not applicable to science at all, as Maia finds out later in the story when a scientist person talks, a neurophilosopher of some sort, just highlighting that the gender binary doesn't exactly make sense when you have so many other factors at play, genetically in the brain and whatnot. And it's not until much later in life that they're able to understand that maybe there is no fitting in. Maybe everyone kind of has their own niche, which helps them better understand themselves, but nobody is normal, as people like to claim that there is a normal. And Maia ultimately points out that there's a certain freedom in realizing that you don't have to fit in. Yes, there's that knowledge that you're never going to fit into that square peg, or that round hole, or whatever we want to say there. There's that knowledge, like, I'm never gonna be normal and have the life that maybe my parents had before me. But there is a freedom in knowing that you don't have to be that way, and that what you are, who you are, your identity that you're slowly beginning to learn about is perfectly natural. It's your discovery, and you don't have to adhere to those other sorts of things. So, fitting in can be very difficult, but also you don't really have to do it. You really just have to find what works best for you and try to move in that direction. Maia Kobabe is also highlighting dysphoria, gender dysphoria here. Kobabe captures the anguish of being uncomfortable in your body remarkably well. This seems like a textbook definition of gender dysphoria, and I'm referring to like the definition from like the DSM-5 or something like that. Like, Kobabe's experience is kind of maybe similar to what a lot of other people have gone through, but also is exactly what medical experts mean when they say gender dysphoria, rather than these weird conservative like attempts to better understand gender dysphoria as some sort of inherent problem with the individual, rather than society's problem of refusing to adapt to the different experiences of each person. So like the Kobabe is just doing a really good job of capturing that. We see that in their pronoun pain. Just being called the wrong pronoun feels wrong, but they don't really want to correct someone because of the, like, am I asking too much of one person? Am I being annoying or something like that? And then the gynecologist appointment in particular, and being penetrated in that way, that just sort of highlights the uncomfortableness, the dysphoria of being reminded that you have like assigned female at birth body parts, like a vagina and those sorts of things, and that's not who you are. That's not who you believe yourself to be, and so you feel like there's a discrepancy there. There's a whole lot more to that I'm probably not listing out. I urge you to go and read as much as you can about that by people who've actually done the full research there. But we also see a number of strange thoughts that come with those feelings of uncomfortability, or that kind of demonstrate the dysphoria at heart. Allow me to read another interesting quote to you. "I started daydreaming about getting breast cancer, thinking it would give me the perfect excuse to have my breast removed." And that's a really short quote, but it gets exactly at the dysphoria there. Like you're so uncomfortable in your body that you're wishing cancer upon yourself. That is pretty harsh. But imagine like the anguish that you must be feeling that brought you to the point in the first place. And this whole book, like, it's been something I've been thinking about for several years now, but this book has helped highlight just a big fact. Not to make it about myself, but this is never something that I have to think about as a cisgender individual. I don't have to think about being comfortable in my body and representing my actual gender appropriately. That's not something I've ever had to deal with, and there's a certain freedom in not having to deal with that, of not having, on top of everything else that life throws at you, having to be worried about whether you're going to be happy with your gender, if you're going to feel this sort of dysphoria. Kobabe is this is something that I think you can kind of relate to, even if you can't relate to it. You can sort of see the additional pressures, even if you maybe never felt those. You can empathize essentially with Kobabe here. I do like though how Kobabe notes that even though this dysphoria is stressful, there is a greater confidence and there is a better feeling in yourself when you find yourself, when you reach that point where you're like, oh, this is who I've been this whole time, and when you're allowed to express yourself like Kobabe does in the story when he wears men's clothing, for example, or when they express themselves in a more masculine way as they want to, or when they escape outside of the gender binary. There's that confidence that they feel, that feeling of pleasure, and an understanding that you don't have to adhere to those standards if that's not how you actually need to feel. Like you're being forced to fit into something that you don't, and when you break away from that, the dysphoria it lessens. It doesn't immediately go away, but it lessens. Kobabe is also talking about questioning here, the process of trying to figure out who you are, and for Kobabe, it's mainly an aspect of trying to better understand your gender and who you are there, and also your sexual identity. What makes you comfortable in the bedroom, if anything makes you comfortable. Specifically noting that maybe asexuality might be the path that he wants to travel down. I like how Kobabe notes that it is a lifelong process. It's not something you're going to figure out overnight. Like in high school, you figure out some things, but in college, you figure out more. And even outside of college, in your adult life, I would say, you're still questioning, trying to figure out where you belong. And even when you have answers, it generates more questions because, you're trying to figure out exactly where you fit. And nobody is no gender is a one size fits all. Like even within masculinity, I'm finding that, the traditional manly man definition of masculinity doesn't necessarily apply to me, but I do define myself by a sense of masculinity that I've sort of created and drafted for myself. That is my own niche right there, and it's something that I continue to explore and figure out as time goes on, and try to better understand what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, and that can always generate questions. But if you're someone like Maia Kobabe, and you fit into a gender that people are still trying to figure out, and which there isn't a lot of writing about, it can be even more difficult. I feel like all of this is very vital for young readers because every reader is kind of having these questions about where they fit. High school in particular is a time of stress because you're wondering, like, am I different from everyone else? Am I normal? And books like this kind of highlight, well, there is no real normal. And what's more than that, they highlight that everyone is struggling, everyone is trying to figure out who they are, and it's a lifelong process. So if young people know that they won't have the answers up front, and that this might take some time, it might make them feel a little better. It'll reduce some stress, and who knows how many mental health issues it'll kind of ease down the road. So Kobabe is doing a lot of good work here and kind of presenting a story that a lot of people really need to hear. Other great things about this are, one thing I like is the LGBT worldview. It's very important to have stories that are presented from this perspective rather than trying to delete those stories and pretend like this community doesn't exist, especially for gender identity, because there's so many stories told from male and female perspectives. But what about transgender? What about people who don't identify in the gender binary? It's important to hear their stories. And again, I equated this to like Fun Home, Flamer, maybe Imiha as well. And I think that's it's important to hear those kinds of stories. Specifically, Maia references Fun Home in this story, referring to a specific page in that book, and I really love that because Fun Home was amazing. I talked about it on this channel before, so I highly recommend that you go seek out that video, but also seek out Fun Home because Alison Bechdel is a great writer, and I put that on one of my year-end lists for 2023 or 2022. I can't exactly remember, but it's a very important read, I would say. And this is kind of continuing that, in that the spectrum of LGBT sort of writings that help people navigate their identities, and at the same time just sort of talk about the struggle of trying to find yourself and the lifelong process of doing all of that. I also think it's interesting how Kobabe is telling this story. He goes beyond, the parent narrative that you see, where you're coming out to your parents and there's a struggle, but ultimately they do or do not accept you. And then you're moving beyond that if they don't accept you. But this is about more than that, because at the very beginning, Kobabe's like, yeah, my parents accepted me for who I am. That's not the problem here. The problem is society. The problem is, myself, trying to figure out who I am here. So I do like how the story goes beyond that. It's good to know, that, your parents aren't going to be the only issue in your gender identity travels, your journey. There's going to be much more than that, and the more stories that we have about that, the more we see that there's, again, a whole spectrum of stories out there, a whole spectrum of struggles and also joys that you might find out once you overcome these hurdles. Now, of course, the last thing worth noting is the fact that this is a banned book. This apparently the second most banned book in the United States at the moment. It might have changed since I've talked about this in 2025. But why, the question to ask is, why is this being banned? And I think, as Kobabe themselves have mentioned, this is probably banned because of the message about LGBT individuals. The right-wing conservative movement is in a rush to sort of erase stories from LGBT individuals, because they say that the LGBT community is trying to groom children, which I firmly disagree with. They say they're presenting stories of colorful comics and whatnot, but that's not really the same as grooming. A lot of stories are presented in comic book format, like Deadpool and Blade and other sorts of really hard, I would say hard R, or rated R or something like that, comic books about bloody fights and whatnot. And those, you never see parents really complain about that, how it's violent ideas given to children. So I would argue that the LGBT kind of stance is probably a large reason why this is getting banned, because it presents the LGBT lifestyle as normal, as something that many people experience, and it's telling kids that that's all right, which the conservative parents absolutely do not want, because they want to be more controlling of their children and not make it seem like the only way to go is to be heterosexual, basically promoting a heteronormative way of life, which is what the United States has done for quite some time. But you could also argue that, it questions the status quo of the heteronormativity, which is one reason that it might be banned. And it also presents finding meaning and understanding outside of men in the traditional conservative way of life. Because the traditional conservative way of life is that women must have children, they must get married, and then have children, of course. And they must commit to that kind of lifestyle of being a homemaker. But here, Maia Kobabe says, no, that's not what needs to happen, because Maya's entire journey takes place outside of the world of men. Yes, there are men in air life, but men are not the sole focus of Maya's life. They're seeking relationships outside of it, and it doesn't begin and end with sex or marriage or children or anything like that. And Maya even says that they don't want children. So I feel like the patriarchal society that tries to control women might also want to control people seeing this type of message. Now, I will give credit and say that it is highly sexual. And so maybe the parents who say this shouldn't be in elementary schools are maybe a little bit right, but to take it out of high schools, I feel is improper. Because, high schoolers need to know about sex at some point. Sure, this does focus on strap-on at one point, but if you hide that from children, if you hide those ways of thinking from young adults, they're going to go into, or they're going to make a lot of mistakes. Like you're not, like, abstinence-only education didn't prevent sex; it just prevented safe sex from happening. So if you don't tell children about these sorts of things, about gender identity in particular, it's going to lead to a whole host of problems, including mental health issues, because if again, like hiding the fact that people struggle with this all the time and that people throw questions out there, it's gonna cause a number of problems, which is not ideal. And ultimately, this is all about controlling children, controlling the narrative that there is only a heteronormative way of thinking, that it's always been men with women, women with men, and no other variation of the thing. It's especially targeting transgender individuals. It's targeting people who are not fitting into the binary, because that's viewed as abnormal to conservative individuals, and when they grab power, they seek to control people and control the messages that get out there, and it ends up hurting communities more often than not, because just because you get rid of these books, just because you make policies that are hostile towards transgender individuals, hostile towards the LGBT community, that doesn't make those people go away. They're always going to be there. They're just going to know that you hate them, and it's going to cause a lot of suffering. And ultimately, what you end up with is, like, I feel like a lot of the reason this is banned is because conservatives are hateful individuals who want to divide the community. Or there are outside stakeholders, like Moms Against Liberty, who come into the community and say this is good or this is bad, even though they're not part of the community. They're essentially a cancer in the community. And as many people have said before, simply taking away these books does not reduce the number of LGBT individuals in a community. It just reduces the number of people who can sort of find their gender identity. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe. A fascinating exploration of gender and sexual identity, a wonderful book, one that I am very happy to have read, and I couldn't have done it without all of the massive chaos and the massive anger by conservatives who said this was not a book that you should read, and that inspired me to go out and read it. Would I have found it if that had not been the case? Who is to say? But I don't believe I would have. Like, I didn't know when this came out. I didn't travel in those circles, but once conservatives got their hooks into it, I became more aware, and I'm sure many other, teenagers became aware, and they probably sought it out as a result, in defiance of their parents, in defiance of the evil community, or evil conservative community members who hate any sort of gender freedom or anything like that. So yeah, I definitely recommend that you go out and read it. If not because it is an excellent read, it is a beautiful read, it is a powerful read. Just because, like, conservatives don't want you to read it. If people don't want you to read something, that is more incentive to go out and read it, in my opinion. And I've heard many other people say the same thing. So yeah, definitely recommend it. If you have anything to say about it, or you want to say something about my review, if you're a conservative freak who wants to criticize me in the comments, do so below. I would love to hear from you. If you're a normal person who doesn't, get upset about this kind of thing, I'd also like to hear from you. But otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that we can, help get the message out there, make it so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and gender questioning travels. Farewell.